For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant. A minor species orbiting a forgettable star. Biologically fragile. Technologically inefficient. In the vast archives of the Galactic Council, Earth merited only a few sterile lines of data. Population trends, industrial limitations, probability curves that all ended the same way. Contained. Manageable. Irrelevant. Ignored by the galaxy. Dismissed by those in power. Humanity was not feared because it did not fit the profile of a threat. Real dangers were loud. They expanded rapidly. They demanded recognition and carved borders in fire. Humanity did none of that. They argued among themselves. They stumbled forward unevenly. Their progress was slow, messy, and constantly interrupted by self-inflicted crises. To the Council, this confirmed everything. No one realized how dangerous that mistake would be, because humanity never evolved in comfort. Where other species developed under long eras of stability, humans grew up inside collapse. Governments failed. Economies crashed. Environments shifted. Systems humanity relied on would betray them, again and again. And every time, they adapted, rebuilt, and learned one lesson deeper than the last. Nothing lasts. Nothing is guaranteed. Prepare anyway. While the galaxy enjoyed the illusion of permanence, humanity learned to survive without it. They did not expect rescue. They did not trust institutions. They did not assume tomorrow would resemble today. So when humanity first brushed against the edges of galactic awareness, they did not announce themselves. They listened, observed, studied trade routes and power structures, learned who enforced authority, and how. The Council mistook this caution for weakness. They believed humanity was intimidated by the scale of the galaxy. In truth, humanity was measuring it. They noticed that the Council ruled not through constant force, but through dependency. Through access to trade. Through recognition. Through the quiet threat of isolation. A species did not need to be conquered to be controlled. It simply needed to believe survival required permission. Humanity took that lesson seriously. When they finally appeared in diplomatic channels, they were unremarkable by design. Polite requests. Perfectly followed protocols. No demands. No urgency. Nothing that would raise alarms. The Council barely noticed. After all, insignificant species did not become relevant simply by being well-behaved. What the Council never considered was that humanity treated information the way others treated weapons. Every answer was archived. Every regulation mapped. Every unspoken assumption logged and tested. Humanity wasn't asking how to belong. They were learning how the system broke. And when the Council eventually tightened its grip, cutting trade, revoking access, pushing humanity toward the margins, it expected the familiar pattern. Panic. Division. Collapse. Instead, humanity did something profoundly unsettling. They adapted. They went quiet, not with fear, but with focus. Old rivalries lost importance. Long-standing divisions were set aside without ceremony. Humanity did not argue about who was right. They asked who would still be alive tomorrow. Because the truth the Council could not control was simple. Humanity had never believed authority was permanent. They had never trusted stability. They had never assumed the galaxy was safe. So when the Council finally realized humanity was no longer reacting, but preparing, it was already too late. The mistake was never underestimating humanity's strength. It was underestimating what a species becomes when it grows up expecting the universe to fail them, and planning to endure anyway. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not with fleets or blockades. Those were crude tools, reserved for species that resisted openly. The Council preferred pressure that left no scorch marks. Pressure that looked reasonable, lawful, inevitable. First came the restrictions. Trade corridors once open to human vessels were flagged for routine review. Docking clearances stalled indefinitely. Insurance guarantees evaporated overnight. Shipments of critical materials, medical compounds, advanced alloys, precision components, were quietly reclassified as non-essential. Trade was cut. Markets trembled. Peripheral colonies felt the shortages first, then the core worlds. Prices spiked. Supply chains strained. Council economists watched the data with detached confidence. They had seen this pattern countless times. Scarcity bred desperation. Desperation bred division. Then came the legal measures. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost access to council chambers. Observer status was suspended, pending reassessment. Information networks that once returned open data now responded with denial notices or heavily filtered fragments. Travel permits expired without renewal. Diplomatic channels thinned to silence. Humanity was no longer treated as a developing participant. They were labeled a variable. Unmanaged. Unpredictable. Inconvenient. Isolation followed naturally. No ships encircled human space. No weapons were aimed at Earth or its colonies. The Council simply removed humanity from the systems that sustained interstellar civilization. No shared logistics. No arbitration. No emergency relief. Humanity was pushed into isolation with the calm certainty of an authority that believed itself unchallengeable. The Council expected collapse. They expected old rivalries to ignite under pressure. Expected colonies to hoard resources. Expected political factions to tear one another apart while pleading for reinstatement. Projections were drafted. Months to economic failure. A year to internal unrest. 2 years to submission. But the collapse never came. Human systems stabilized instead of spiraling. Emergency protocols appeared before shortages peaked. Production lines shifted priorities without debate or delay. Rationing was enacted calmly, efficiently, without panic. There were no mass riots. No planetary secessions. Human communication traffic surged, but not with outrage. With coordination. Long-standing disputes were paused without ceremony. Rival blocs stopped posturing and started sharing data. Arguments that had defined generations suddenly felt irrelevant. The Council flagged the anomaly. Then dismissed it. They mistook restraint for denial. What they failed to understand was that humanity had practiced for this their entire history. Economic crashes. Political failures. Environmental catastrophes. Systems breaking when they were needed most. Isolation wasn't unfamiliar. It was expected. Humanity didn't demand reinstatement. Didn't appeal to council morality. Didn't threaten retaliation. They did something far more unsettling. They stopped asking. Trade rerouted inward. Local industries expanded to fill roles once outsourced to the galaxy. Old technologies were dusted off, redesigned, and scaled beyond what council standards had ever allowed. Regulations were followed, perfectly. Every rule observed to the letter. Every clause exploited exactly as written. Sanctions designed to isolate human space began to ripple outward, damaging council-aligned economies that depended on human adaptability more than they realized. The Council waited for fracture. Instead, humanity grew quieter. More ordered. More deliberate. Reports began to note a disturbing trend. Human space was becoming self-sufficient. Less reliant on external trade. Less affected by political pressure. Less responsive to authority that functioned only when it was believed in. Containment had worked for centuries because species feared isolation. Humanity did not. They treated it as a condition to engineer around. And somewhere deep in the Council's projections, a realization began to form, one they did not yet have the courage to acknowledge. You cannot control a civilization that has learned how to survive without you. And once that lesson is learned, authority becomes a suggestion, not a law. Isolation was supposed to be the final pressure. The Council's own history proved it. Cut a civilization off from trade, legitimacy, and external support, and it would fracture along old fault lines. Pride would become paranoia. Cooperation would rot into competition. Eventually, desperation would force compliance. Humanity fit the model perfectly. Too many governments. Too many ideologies. Too much unresolved history. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, the change was subtle. Political broadcasts softened. Old arguments lost urgency. Emergency measures were debated less and implemented faster. When every external channel fell silent, Humanity stopped arguing about who was right and started asking who would still be alive tomorrow. Old divisions vanished. Not erased, set aside. Borders remained on maps, but they stopped dictating behavior. Rivalries that had defined centuries were paused without treaties or public ceremony. There was no victory, no reconciliation speeches. Just necessity. Because isolation stripped away illusions. There was no higher authority to appeal to. No external stabilizer to rely on. No one else coming to intervene. Humanity was alone. And once that truth settled in, everything aligned. Planetary governments convened emergency councils, then quietly dissolved overlapping layers of authority. Redundant bureaucracies were merged or discarded. Decision-making chains were shortened. Not centralized for dominance, but streamlined for speed. What emerged was not an empire. It was coordination. For the first time in human history, every major colony agreed on a single operational framework. Not ideology. Not culture. Survival. All colonies stood under one command. It was not a throne or a figurehead. It was a structure, lean, adaptable, brutally pragmatic. Leadership was situational. Authority flowed to whoever had the clearest data and the fastest response. Ego became a liability. Logistics became power. Supply chains that once competed were synchronized across systems. Manufacturing priorities aligned without debate. Research divisions opened archives that had been sealed for generations, sharing breakthroughs that had once been guarded behind profit and pride. Humanity stopped optimizing for advantage over one another. They optimized for endurance. Military forces changed first, not in size, but in purpose. Fleets once aimed at deterrence were redeployed to protect infrastructure, evacuation routes, and population centers. Training doctrine shifted away from decisive victories and toward sustained survival under catastrophic conditions. Humanity stopped planning for wars they hoped to win. They planned for disasters they intended to outlast. Civilians were folded into the system, not as soldiers, but as participants. Engineers trained in emergency repair. Medics drilled for mass casualty scenarios. Colonists learned redundancy protocols as naturally as daily routines. Humanity did not militarize its population. It prepared it. The silence that followed was unsettling. There were no mass protests. No grand declarations. No pleas broadcast into the void. Human communication traffic actually decreased, even as coordination reached levels the Council had never observed in any species. Unity did not make humanity louder. It made them efficient, focused, unpredictable. Council observers misread the data. They saw quiet and assumed submission. They believed humanity had accepted containment. In truth, humanity had accepted reality. They no longer measured success by recognition or inclusion. They measured it by resilience. By how well systems held under pressure. By how little external approval mattered. Isolation had done what no treaty ever could. It forced humanity to see itself as a single organism. Every colony understood its role. Every fleet knew its purpose. Every citizen knew what was at stake. If no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Not out of defiance. Out of clarity. And that was the truth the Council could not control. A fragmented species can be managed. A divided civilization can be pressured. But a species unified by survival, one that no longer believes authority guarantees safety, cannot be contained. Humanity had not united to challenge the galaxy. They had united to endure it. And once that happened, the Council's leverage, trade, recognition, isolation, lost its meaning entirely. Because unity born of necessity does not dissolve when pressure increases. It hardens. And humanity was no longer something the galaxy could afford to misunderstand. In silence, humanity evolved. Not in ways that produced headlines. Not in ways that triggered alarms. Not in ways the galaxy knew how to measure. There were no grand announcements, no ceremonial unveilings, no declarations of technological supremacy. Humanity had learned that visibility invited interference. So progress became quiet, hidden behind routine traffic, civilian infrastructure, and systems that looked ordinary to anyone not paying very close attention. While the Council focused elsewhere, human space transformed. New engines came first. Not engines designed for record-breaking speed or dramatic displays of power, but for endurance. Drives that ran longer, required fewer rare materials, and functioned under damage conditions that would cripple standard designs. Human vessels became less dependent on resupply routes, less reliant on external infrastructure. They didn't travel faster. They traveled without stopping. Human ships could cross vast distances and remain operational in isolation for years. No trade ports required. No external logistics chains. No fragile dependencies. Then came the shields. The Council favored singular, powerful defensive systems, massive energy barriers that either held or failed catastrophically. Humanity rejected that logic completely. They built layers, adaptive fields that shifted under stress, redundant systems that failed gradually instead of all at once, overlapping architectures that redistributed force instead of resisting it directly. Human shields were not invincible. They were resilient. They bent. They degraded. They endured. Damage became something to absorb, not something to fear. Weapons development followed, but quietly and without obsession. Humanity did not pursue planet killers or spectacle weapons. They focused on reliability, integration, and sustainability. Systems that could function after months of isolation. Systems that could be repaired in the field with limited resources. Human weapons were not terrifying. They were dependable. Then came the fleets. They were not built in massive centralized shipyards that could be monitored, targeted, or disabled. Production was distributed across dozens of systems. Civilian industries fabricated components alongside commercial goods. Modular hulls were assembled in small facilities, then moved quietly into position. No single location mattered. No single strike could cripple production. Fleets were built not for conquest, but survival. Human fleet doctrine reflected it. Ships were designed to operate independently, assuming loss of communication as a baseline condition. Crews were cross-trained relentlessly. Every officer understood logistics. Every technician understood combat priorities. Every commander was trained to function without higher authority. Human doctrine no longer relied on perfection. It relied on adaptability. Scenarios assumed overwhelming odds, assumed isolation, assumed systemic collapse, and trained for it. The galaxy noticed none of this. Council sensors saw no alarming buildup, no aggressive maneuvers, no mass mobilizations. Human space looked quiet, predictable, contained, exactly as intended. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared, not for war, for inevitability. Human strategic planning abandoned optimism. They modeled hostile universes, collapsing alliances, enemies that did not negotiate, systems that failed without warning. Victory conditions were rewritten. Not defeat the enemy. Ensure continuation. If a colony survived, it was success. If a fleet endured, it was success. If humanity continued, everything else was secondary. Command structures flattened. Authority became situational. Any unit could assume leadership. Any plan could be abandoned instantly if reality demanded it. Humanity stopped fearing chaos. They learned to function inside it. The Council, reviewing outdated reports, concluded humanity had stagnated. That isolation had capped their development. That containment had worked. They were catastrophically wrong. Humanity had not stalled. They had finished building. They were no longer experimenting or catching up. They were refining, stress testing, positioning quietly in the dark. And when the galaxy finally looked back toward human space, it would not find a weak civilization struggling in isolation. It would find something far more unsettling. A species that had evolved in silence, built for survival instead of dominance, and prepared for a future where control, authority, and stability were no longer guaranteed. Humanity wasn't growing anymore. They were ready. I prefer this response. The first warning was easy to ignore. A frontier system failed to report in, no distress signal, no debris, no signs of battle. Council analysts marked it as a relay malfunction and reassigned the monitoring task. Border regions were unstable by nature. Data gaps happened. Then another system went silent. Then another. By the time the pattern emerged, the name the Dominion was already spreading through refugee channels and fragmented intelligence leaks. Not as a rumor, but as a certainty. They did not announce themselves. They did not negotiate. They arrived. The Dominion was not an alliance or a coalition. It was a machine built for expansion, refined over countless conquests. Their fleets moved with disciplined precision, overwhelming defenses before panic could fully take hold. Worlds fell. Orbital platforms were disabled in minutes. Planetary shields collapsed under sustained, methodical pressure. Resistance forces were dismantled piece by piece, not destroyed in dramatic last stands, but rendered irrelevant. The Dominion did not seek chaos. They sought control. Species were enslaved. Not exterminated, sorted. Populations were catalogued by function. Administrators were retained. Labor forces were assigned. Entire civilizations were reduced to logistical assets. Those who resisted were removed efficiently, without spectacle. Fear spread faster than their fleets ever could. Refugees flooded council space carrying recordings no one wanted to analyze too closely. Fleets that had guarded borders for millennia vanished in single engagements. Council task forces engaged the Dominion and failed, not catastrophically, but quietly, as if they had never mattered. And still, the Council argued. Emergency sessions were convened and dissolved into procedural paralysis. Ancient rivalries resurfaced. Voting blocks stalled action. Committees debated response thresholds, while live feeds showed cities burning and evacuation corridors collapsing. Some delegates called for negotiation. Others demanded sanctions. A few suggested sacrifice, ceding outer systems to buy time. Time was something the Dominion did not allow. As invasion fronts pushed inward, the Council's authority began to crack. Member species recalled fleets to defend their own worlds. Mutual defense treaties were reinterpreted, delayed, or ignored outright. The Council could recommend. It could debate. But it could not act. Within cycles, the unthinkable became reality. The Galactic Council, the oldest authority in the galaxy, was losing. That was when the chamber went quiet. Someone said the name no one wanted to hear. Humanity. Objections came immediately. Humanity was isolated, sanctioned, politically sidelined. Their fleets were undocumented. Their technology unverified. Their intentions uncertain. Some delegates still insisted humanity was barely holding itself together under containment. But others remembered. Human space had gone silent long before the Dominion arrived. No pleas for aid. No collapse. No chaos spilling across borders. Just absence, orderly, deliberate absence. Reluctantly, the Council authorized contact. The message they sent was careful, polite, urgent without sounding desperate. It spoke of shared survival, collective defense, and the need for unity against an existential threat. It did not mention sanctions. It did not include apologies. Humanity received it. They did not respond immediately. While Council worlds burned, humanity reviewed the data. Dominion fleet compositions. Tactical patterns. Logistics throughput. Behavioral doctrine. They compared it against internal simulations, some of which mirrored the unfolding invasion with disturbing accuracy. The Council expected panic. They got analysis. When humanity finally replied, the response was calm, measured, almost unsettling in its restraint. They acknowledged the Dominion threat. They confirmed the Council's projections were optimistic. They stated plainly that humanity possessed the capability to engage. There was no promise of rescue, only consideration. The Council protested, invoked shared destiny, demanded urgency, reminded humanity of what was at stake. Humanity did not hurry. Because another system fell, this one close enough to the Council core that evacuation sirens echoed through the chamber itself. Delegates who had argued procedure minutes earlier now begged for intervention. In that moment, the truth crystallized. The Council had isolated the one civilization that had prepared for abandonment. They had contained the species that planned for systemic failure. They had dismissed the people who built for survival instead of dominance. The Dominion did not fear authority. It did not respect tradition. It did not pause for debate. And the only civilization that had planned for an enemy like that was the one the Council had tried to control. Finally, stripped of leverage and illusion, the Galactic Council did the unthinkable. They turned to humanity, not as a subordinate, not as a member, but as the last civilization that might still be capable of acting, while everyone else was still arguing over what should be done. The Council expected forgiveness. They had rehearsed for it, statements of unity, acknowledgments of past misunderstandings, carefully balanced language meant to sound regretful without admitting fault. In crises, forgiveness had always followed fear. Authority bent, but it endured. This time, it didn't. Humanity acknowledged the Council's transmission within minutes. No symbolism. No ceremony. Just confirmation of receipt and verification of the data provided. They requested clarification on several inconsistencies in the Council's threat assessments. The Council answered immediately. Then they waited. When humanity's response arrived, it was calm to the point of discomfort. They confirmed the Dominion's expansion vector. They confirmed the Council's defenses would fail. They confirmed humanity had prepared for such a scenario. Then came the sentence that hollowed out the chamber. We will decide when to act. No accusation followed. No anger. No conditions. Just a statement of reality. The Council erupted. Delegates shouted about moral obligations, shared survival, and ancient accords. Some accused humanity of arrogance. Others called the response reckless, even cruel. A few tried to reassert authority, citing treaties, sanctions, and jurisdiction as if repetition might restore their weight. Humanity did not reply. They didn't need to. Because authority is not something you declare in a crisis. It is something that either functions or doesn't. Within hours, long-range sensors detected anomalies along the periphery of human-controlled space. Not weapon signatures. Not fleet mobilizations. Subtle distortions, rhythmic, synchronized, deliberate. Gravitational arrays registered fluctuations too precise to be natural. Navigation beacons recalibrated themselves without instruction. Observatories detected harmonics in the fabric of space that bent light just enough to unsettle seasoned analysts. It was as if space itself was being adjusted. Council engineers blamed sensor drift. They were wrong. Independent traders began reporting sightings, vast silhouettes appearing and vanishing beyond detection thresholds. Not fleets moving into formation, but structures repositioning with mathematical intent. Patterns that suggested preparation on a scale the Council had never attempted. Humanity was not rushing. They were aligning. A final transmission arrived, short, unencrypted, and unmistakably human. Any engagement with the Dominion would occur on human-selected terms. Human command would determine location, timing, and scope. Council authorization was unnecessary. Oversight would not be accepted. This was not a threat. It was a boundary. For the first time since its founding, the Galactic Council confronted a reality it had never planned for. A civilization that did not need its permission, did not fear its displeasure, and did not mistake urgency for obligation. As the chamber descended into chaos, something unexpected happened on the invasion front. The Dominion slowed. Not halted. Not repelled. Just slowed, enough for Dominion commanders to notice irregularities in their projections. Enough for them to question assumptions that had never failed before. Somewhere beyond sanctioned space, something vast had finished positioning itself. Space itself seemed to tremble. Humanity had not yet acted. But the truth the Council could not control was already clear to everyone watching. Containment was over. Authority had shifted. And when humanity finally chose to act, it would not be because they were asked, but because they had decided the moment had arrived. The Dominion never detected the beginning of the war. There was no surge of power in subspace. No distortion wave. No warning flare screaming across their sensor nets. One moment, their invasion fleets advanced with disciplined certainty, thousands of warships aligned in perfect formations, confident in a doctrine that had crushed every civilization it had encountered. The next moment, space was no longer empty. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. They did not arrive from anywhere. They did not tear open reality or announce themselves with violent energy spikes. They simply resolved into existence, vast structures unfolding from the void as if space itself had decided to give them shape. Massive, precise, unstoppable. The formations were wrong by every known tactical doctrine. Not concentrated, not aggressive. Distributed across light minutes of space, each vessel occupying a position that denied escape routes, reinforcement vectors, and retreat corridors all at once. It wasn't an attack posture. It was containment. Dominion sensors struggled to reconcile the data. Targeting solutions lagged behind reality. Command algorithms recalculated endlessly, unable to explain how such mass had appeared without violating every predictive model they relied on. Before the first firing order could be issued, every channel lit up. Military command frequencies. Encrypted tactical relays. Emergency fallback bands. Even internal fleet coordination links. One message crossed every protocol simultaneously. Stand down. It was not amplified. Not threatening. It carried no emotion at all. The Dominion fired. They always did. The opening volley never reached its targets. Human defenses did not intercept the energy, they absorbed it. Adaptive fields reshaped in real time, distributing force across layered systems designed to bend, degrade, and endure. What should have overwhelmed any known shield simply vanished into controlled dissipation. The Dominion adjusted. They never got the chance to fire again. Weapon systems across the invasion fleet desynchronized by fractions of a second, too small to notice individually, catastrophic in aggregate. Power grids slipped out of phase. Reactors throttled down to emergency limits. Shields collapsed inward, not destroyed but rendered inert. Drives failed. Thousands of ships went dead in space. Alive. Intact. Helpless. Humanity had not attacked the fleet. They had removed its ability to fight. Across the Dominion Armada, command hierarchies unraveled. Emergency protocols refused to execute. Self-destruct sequences failed silently. Engineers screamed into command channels that no longer responded. Human systems were not fighting Dominion technology. They were exploiting it. They reached into assumptions so fundamental the Dominion had never thought to protect them. Dependencies that worked flawlessly against weaker enemies and catastrophically against an opponent that planned for resilience instead of dominance. One human vessel moved. It advanced alone, gliding forward with deliberate calm. Its hull bore no markings, no insignia, no declaration of ownership. Just a presence so controlled it felt inevitable. It transmitted once more. This conflict is concluded. There were no demands, no negotiations. The statement was final. As data propagated through Dominion command networks, fleets in neighboring systems halted mid-advance. Slave transports powered down. Occupation forces abandoned positions without orders, uncertain whether movement itself would trigger the same silent neutralization. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Only then did humanity acknowledge the galaxy. A brief open transmission, factual, restrained, and devoid of triumph. The threat had been neutralized. Hostilities were over. No territory had changed hands. Humanity had not come to conquer. They had come to stop the war. Council observers watched in stunned silence as Dominion ships drifted powerless in the dark, entire armadas undone without explosions, without spectacle, without permission. And in that moment, a truth settled across the stars. The Galactic Council had not lost control because humanity seized it. They lost it because control no longer mattered in the presence of someone who could act. The galaxy had seen the difference. And it would never again confuse authority with power. The Council tried to reclaim control. Emergency sessions were called in rapid succession. Charters were reread. Authority clauses were reaffirmed with louder voices and sharper language. Committees were formed to review humanity's actions, to define jurisdiction, to remind the galaxy that order still flowed from the council chambers. The galaxy listened. Then it went on without them. It was too late. Because authority, once revealed as optional, does not return through insistence. Worlds that had survived the Dominion's advance rebuilt without waiting for Council approval. Defense agreements formed laterally, between neighbors who trusted preparation more than procedure. Trade resumed along routes humanity had stabilized, ignoring the sanctioned lanes that once defined legitimacy. The Council still existed, but it was no longer central. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They refused every offer of permanent leadership, declined expanded representation, ignored proposals to restructure the Council with humanity at its core. They claimed no territory, imposed no laws, demanded no tribute. They simply stepped back, not into isolation, but into readiness. Human fleets dispersed across the dark in patterns no political model could predict. They did not hover over capitals or patrol borders. They positioned themselves where instability had always emerged: fracture zones, historical fault lines, regions where authority had failed before. Always distant, always watching, never demanding obedience. The galaxy slowly understood what humanity had become. Not rulers, not enforcers, a contingency. When disputes flared, humanity did not intervene. When empires postured and threatened one another, humanity remained silent. They did not issue warnings. They did not promise protection. Their presence alone was enough. Former Dominion officers, those few left alive and free, shared stories quietly. Not of human weapons, but of human restraint. Of fleets that could have annihilated them and chose instead to end a war cleanly, decisively, and without spectacle. That restraint carried more weight than terror ever had. The Council issued one final declaration, warning that a galaxy without centralized authority would descend into chaos. Few listened. Fewer believed it. Because the galaxy had learned something the Council never had. Stability enforced by tradition eventually fails. Stability enforced by readiness endures. Humanity had proven that leadership was not granted by age, titles, or unanimous votes. It emerged from the willingness to act when action was required, and the discipline to stop when it was not. So the galaxy adapted. It always does. And somewhere beyond the bright halls of power, beyond the chambers where authority once lived, humanity watched the stars in silence. They did not rule the galaxy. They had no desire to. They had simply proven a truth no civilization could forget. If darkness rises again, if something worse emerges from the void, if the galaxy hesitates when it matters most, humanity will be there. Not to command, not to conquer, but to make sure there is still a galaxy left when the darkness falls.